Buju, Bodawat mi, Mina Chmokmanko Endao, Hogagan Ban in the Bendagwas, Duwajak Dochpia, Mina Duwajak Adayan, Makinak Ondo Dem, Ngisko no, she Dartmouth College, Uk, Non-Gotkin, Nichawiji, Hogagan Ban Language and Culture Department, the National Ndo, the Kenomadis, Obritish Moment. Mina Ngom, Bodwawad Minwin, Mina language revitalization practices, Mina language planning Gri Widamonum. That's my trying to tell you what I'm about to say in a free translation. Hello. Okay, I meant to say Buju Jayakima. Hello everyone. Hello, my name is Corinne Kasper. I am a member of the Pavilion Band of Potawatomi Indians. I am Snapping Turtle Clan. I was raised in Dowagiac, Michigan, and I live there now. I went to school at Dartmouth College, and since graduating, I have been working for the tribe in a number of capacities. From time to time, that includes tutoring, which is through the education department, and working at language and culture as an independent contractor. I have worked for language and culture intermittently over the past 4 or 5 years during the summer when I would come back from school. And in that time, I have more or less been involved in a number of the revitalization efforts in the tribe. So today I'm going to talk to you guys about Bodwawad-Miwin, the Potawatomi language, and some revitalization practices and a bit about the practices of my tribe. First, though, I would like to say thank you for inviting me here to speak. It's very cool. It's my first keynote, so I was like, what do I say? And then I was like, I'll just say everything I think at all times. And also, welcome to the St. Joseph River Valley, and as such, the Potawatomi territory. It's been said while we're going through this conference, but it always bears repeating, especially at academic institutions. Sometimes the academy has a poor memory in that regard. Additionally, yeah, it's just an honor for me to be here on these lands that my family comes from for so long. So before I begin, I need to tell you more about how I situate myself within my community and on these lands. My grandparents were Edna Ray Williams, Doherty, and Mike Doherty. They had my mom, and also my aunts and uncle. My grandfather wasn't Potawatomi, but he was very involved with the tribe. And my grandmother's parents were Michael Booktu Williams and Cecilia Topash. She grew up here in South Bend, and she was able to stay in South Bend to go to school, but her parents were of the generation that went to Mount Pleasant, for the Indian residential boarding schools. And that led to my grandma not speaking Potawatomi, even though I have heard in language dates something along the lines of, I don't know why Ray doesn't speak Indian. Her parents were always speaking real good Indian, which is fun to be reading. And you're like, oh wow, that's my grandma, amazing. But her not speaking Potawatomi wasn't because she was ashamed of her heritage. It was just a different time. On the contrary, she was incredibly proud of being Potawatomi. In fact, both of my grandparents were heavily involved with the tribe, as I said earlier. They both devoted so much of their lives to serving the tribe. They were involved in tribal government and the decades-long fights for sovereignty and federal recognition. And I spent most of my early childhood hanging out with my grandma. I hung out with my grandma and my aunt, and we ran errands, and I went to the Pokagon Band run Head Start program, and I hung out a lot with them and elders, and it was really fun. And being raised essentially in this tribal community and by my parents and aunts and uncles and siblings and my grandma, while spending a lot of time at the Tribal Elders Hall and Head Start, and occasionally at enrollment meetings, it was instilled in me this sense of pride in being Potawatomi. And my grandma especially taught me how to be Potawatomi and how to be proud and never be ashamed of who I am. My grandma said, I read it in a book once, my grandma said this. She said that her grandma was real Indian, she's really traditional, but that's the way that I think of her. I think of my grandma as a very traditional woman, or as traditional as she could be at the time. And she gave me this pride, and that pride is a gift. It really is, it's a privilege. And now everything I do with my family in mind, and my ancestors in mind, and my community in mind, in the hopes that they will approve and that I can make them proud. It's important for me to tell you how I ground my work in the connection I have to my family, where I come from, and a sense of duty not only to my community, but also my ancestors. So when I was like 12, maybe 13, my uncle started taking me to Potawatomi language classes. Back then, there were fewer resources to go to the language program. You know, it was at Rogers Lake, which is where the administration was. It was in a trailer, I remember. I was young, so I don't remember exactly what it was like, but I'm pretty sure it was the education trailer, and it was kind of drafty. And then it burned down. I remember that, but we weren't there for that. I'm here now. So a lot has changed in the decades since the first time I went to language classes. There is a whole department devoted to language and culture, which is amazing. The language program itself has grown from, I guess, one person when Rhonda was like, you know, well, there are more people who like head of language, but at one point there was like one person working, and now there are 6 people in the language program, which is so cool. 7 if you include me when I hang out there sometimes. And also the language community itself, so the people who go to classes, and people who want to learn, and people who are taking those steps and the effort to learn, has grown so much since those first memories in the education department. Mobile thing? I don't know, it was like a box. Yeah, it burned down. So back then, there were only people who would consistently attend classes, and of course, those people still attend classes. It's been, you know, this core group that's expanded, and like, really, they've been here since the beginning, and they're in it for the long haul, which is longer than I have been alive. So people have always been trying to learn or relearn the language, and their efforts have got the community to where we are now. And now, there is such a strong group of people, as I said, who are consistently showing up and trying so hard to learn language, and this makes me really proud. Like, I'm very happy to be Potawatomi, and I'm so pleased that I get to learn the language. You know, with the history of boarding schools and, I guess, colonial efforts to stifle our senses of self, our identities, our languages, and get rid of them, it's really, I'm very glad that we get to learn it now. So yeah, until recently, the number of people showing up to language classes wasn't quite as high, and honestly, I would attribute that to the development and number of resources going into the language and culture program, department, whatever you call it. And there's a number of reasons exactly for that. I mean, you know, everyone at language culture is dedicated to, you know, keeping our traditions alive and speaking our language. And Rhonda, the coordinator, I really think is quite the innovator. She's so hardworking, and she's very smart. And one of the initiatives she started was this Master Apprentice program, which, if you want to know some background, essentially this linguist at Berkeley, who is now emeritus faculty, Leanne Hinton, wrote this book, and she said, you know how you can learn language? Hang out with elders who speak it. It makes sense. So what happened was Rhonda heard about it, and she said, this is a good idea, and then it spread to Carla and Kyle, who are awesome. Kyle's here, he's great, he's the coolest. The program sent 2 language learners to Forest County, Wisconsin, children from fluent elders up there, when they came back, which was pretty recent. Basically when I came back from college too, so, I was like, hey. It kind of felt like the language program here was reinvigorated because they are 2 pretty conversant people living in the area for the first time in a while, and they're willing to share their knowledge, which is so, so cool. So, since I came back from college, and since Carla and Kyle came back to the area, I felt that people across all age groups and across levels of Potawatomi knowledge seem more relaxed or freer to speak Potawatomi, or maybe less embarrassed to make mistakes while speaking, which is really, really cool. I have heard language teachers, aside from Carla and Kyle, all language teachers speak in Potawatomi for longer durations of time. and more fluidly since their return, which is really cool. It just feels like the language is gelling in our brains now in a way that I hadn't seen in my short time of learning the language. But the teaching approaches have changed a bit across the program, and people seem more relaxed. This relaxed atmosphere is very useful for language revitalization contexts. Even if people aren't sure that they're learning very fast, or that they aren't sure if they're learning enough, they're talking, they're creating their own sentences. They're legitimately saying what they think with the words they know and the sentence structures they know, which is the coolest thing in the world. Right? Imagine the first time you first said a sentence in a different language and you're like, wow, I could go there and live and I wouldn't die and be great. So people doing this and people feeling relaxed to speak isn't necessarily a guarantee in every language revitalization context or community. People don't always feel comfortable speaking for some fears of maybe they'll mess up in their heritage language, which is, it hits you kind of in your soul. You're like, wow, this is a language that I'm supposed to know, but I can't do it, and it's hard. My uncle says he worries that being put on the spot to speak and do it correctly or perfectly brings people back to a time when they were in school and felt embarrassed for getting things wrong. And that feels accurate. No one wants to be wrong. This is a common kind of trouble or concern in other communities as well. There is one Algonquinist, which is a linguist who studies Algonquian languages. Potawatomi is an Algonquian language. His name is Connor Quinn, this linguist, and he says there are few options and concerns for adult heritage language learners. So he says that the recurrent problems in language revitalization classes, especially for adults, are either no one shows up or everyone gives up. And he says this is mostly because they either already think the language is too hard, which is no one shows up, or they find the classes for them are too hard once they go, and then everyone gives up, which is sad. And a lot of people want to learn. It's their heritage, it gives them the connection to who they are, but they find it overwhelming. And a goal from his research is to make language easier to learn and spread the word that it's possible. So for the Penobscot, Passamaquoddy, Maliseet, and Mi'kmaq communities he works in, the approach is to slow things down. It's not to start with the simplest forms and expand from there. It's to start with the simplest version of the most complex thing and then work backwards. So these lessons he has, or that they've developed in those communities, is it's only a few sentences at a time. So you learn a couple sentences and you learn very, very difficult verbal paradigms. You learn a lot of verbs and a lot of different ways to conjugate them. But the lessons are approachable and teachable once you know them. They are not intimidating, and that's the main goal, to reduce adult learner anxiety in those communities, or one goal they're working toward. For us, Pokegan Band, recently we seem to have this relaxed environment going, and this relaxed speech thing, it's really amazing. I'm pretty hyped about it. And these continued efforts for us will only improve, grow, and strengthen our speech community here. And although the language learning community has gotten larger or stronger, in my opinion, in the past few years, that doesn't mean that the language is any easier or that the number of fluent speakers has suddenly skyrocketed. There are still more second language speakers of Klingon than there are second language fluent speakers of Potawatomi, and this, remember, Klingon is a constructed language for a made-up race of aliens on the science fiction television show Star Trek about fake space and fake space voyages in the 23rd century. Potawatomi is a real language that came about through natural human interaction and is my very own and very real my heritage language. And so a little different. At the same time, Klingon, because it's constructed, has very few irregularities, so it's very easy to learn. There's even a first language speaker, so a baby who learned it. But he gave up when he was like 3 because he said, no one speaks this language. This is stupid. Stop singing the Imperial March to me, Dad. I don't want to sing it. It's a little different from Potawatomi, but it's, related. So in our community, the classes and the teachers have just started to take a different approach, and their efforts are paying off. Maybe one day we will defeat the Klingons. So aside from people seeming more relaxed, I haven't seen a change in the way people relate to language. Like I said, it's not any easier to learn. It hasn't changed rapidly. People still talk about it the same way. And over the past decade, and I'm very young and I haven't been learning for that long, but I've heard people say things over and over again like, Potawatomi, it's just a different way of wiring your brain to be able to think like that, or it's just so much different from English, like I don't know how I can learn it, why we don't have any textbooks, it's hard, or you have to hold your tongue differently so that you can say the words and pronounce them right. And my favorite is always, this language is so hard, it makes sense why you're so smart, because our brains are better. So there have always been reasons that people say language is so difficult to learn, but people always find a reason to come to language classes and to try to learn. And it's for reasons like, this is our heritage. It's, a sacred gift from the Creator. It gives us a connection to our families. It lets our prayers be heard clearer. And people are like, this is a cool language, I'm gonna learn it, which is my favorite reason. There are so many reasons people give as to why they want to learn a language, and they're always so positive. So it's actually a really different time back from when Potawatomi wasn't exactly safe to speak. You weren't safe to speak it. So the time has changed since, I don't know, before 1978. So over this past decade, I have heard people complain about the language being difficult to acquire as a speaker of English, as I said earlier. And as a result, I decided that when I go to college, not only to get more knowledge, I would want to learn linguistics. So when I got to campus, the fall of my freshman year, I signed up for an introduction to linguistics class. And I was like, wow, this is fun. The problem sets are fun to do. I really love historical linguistics and morphology, so I'm going to run with this. And I took that idea and I ran with it, really ran with it. I said, maybe one day I can return to my home community and help out with the revitalization efforts of my tribe. And it made sense to me, right? Like, it was fun to do. I like the problem sets. I love my family, I love my community. If I tie those together, maybe I can help, hopefully. But at first, I didn't really understand how linguistics could mesh with language revitalization. But I figured, I was like, I'll just figure it out later, eventually. Or maybe I'll base my own research on that of other Native American scholars. And at some point, I realized that I would have to be able to both understand and describe Potawatomi as a Potawatomi person learning the language, as a heritage speaker, as an adult learner, and as a linguist. And those are very different approaches to language learning, which I will talk about later. So eventually, those ideas of combining linguistics, or linguistes, and Potawatomi teaching methods, they led to my research in college. My largest research project was my senior fellowship, and the title of my senior fellowship was Three Fires, Verbal Morphology and Grammatical Description, subtitled Implications for Potawatomi Pedagogy. And it sounds very academic, I am aware, but I feel like Dartmouth was happy with that title than they would have been with, I really just want to learn my language and also go fly home and see my mom, and also this grounds me in who I am, and really it makes me feel better, and it's the only thing I ever want to do when I go to school. I hate school. School's no fun, also pay for my research, so I named it that instead of that. Overall, my project focused heavily on analyzing and comparing Ojibwe, Odawa, and Potawatomi for the purpose of language revitalization and language planning. To explain, Ojibwe and Odawa are technically the same language. Odawa is just a dialect, and Potawatomi is a very, very close relative to Ojibwe and Odawa. And I split that research on those three languages into three main sections. comparative Algonquian, so that was comparing the languages. Potawatomi, verbal morphology, or morphological analysis, and grammatical leveling and extension. Grammatical leveling and extension was the comparison to Odawa, because at some point during a course, so there's a academic, Dustin Bowers, who did research on Odawa that kind of, briefly to summarize it, he went through it and he said, oh, there was a generation of speakers that was smaller, and they, at some point, there were too many changes in the way the words sound in different environments or different places they talked about them or talked with them. So these kids said, no, we don't want to say that. We'll just say it different, and then the grammar kind of changed a little bit, but it changed in very regular ways. And then language planning, I talked about in my project, because when you purposely change a language like that, because if it's a comparison, you're talking about purposely changing language, you are planning the future of language. So it's not like language planning and how a lot of them talk about language planning. Okay. From there, I more fully, discuss pedagogical approaches, comparing Ojibwe and Odawa teaching methods to Potawatomi teaching methods. Mostly it was for the purpose of understanding the restructuring in Odawa and proposing language teaching focusing on that restructuring. The accompanying paper, I wrote detailed many aspects of grammatical analysis. A brief summary of that paper for Potawatomi as I described in that paper, and how Potawatomi is generally described in linguistics, is Potawatomi is a polysynthetic, non-configurational, hierarchical language with a relatively free word order. And I wouldn't say that's exactly in our own words. At least as I was used to describing Potawatomi before I entered the realm of linguistic analysis. Before then I probably would have said Potawatomi is hard. And the verb conjugations are a lot. And I like it. There are a lot of verbs. So technically, the linguistic description is more precise, but does it really make sense to anyone who's not a linguist? No, probably not. So that converting that linguistic rhetoric or wording, whatever you want to call it, into an easier to read format and less confusing structures was the main hurdle after actually doing the research and analyzing the languages. And because I came out on the other side of all that drama last year, I can tell you now what I actually did. In general, I looked at Potawatomi, Ojibwe, and Odawa, very similar languages. I thought Ojibwe is like Potawatomi, but the words are longer. They're two very similar languages. And Odawa is like Potawatomi because the words have the same sort of stress patterns that make words either longer or shorter, depending on the verb conjugations you have to do, or noun conjugations, I guess you have to do. From there, I thought we could compare, or I could compare the verbal structures to see if there are similarities that are being taught more effectively in other communities. Then I realized that the stress patterns in Odawa and Potawatomi could be compared in the way I talked about earlier. So an example of that, I like to use Bamosa, which is, walk around. In Odawa, you would say something like Ni Bamosa for I walk around, Ngi Bamosa for I walked. But in Odawa, you could say either Ngi Bamosa for I walked around, Mbamsa for I walk, or Nda Bamosa for I walk. This is the same in Potawatomi. Potawatomi, it is Ngi Bamosa, I walked around. Nda Bamosa, I walk around. Mbamsa, I walk around. So if you listen, Bamsa and Bamosa, they're a little different in small ways, but they're different enough that it can be confusing to some learners. And so the learners in Odawa said Bamsa's a lot or too much. It's oversimplifying the actual what happened, but I'm just saying it as a easy way of, I guess, understanding it. Bamsa's too hard. Let's just always have the duh, so we can have Ndabamosa and Ngibamosa, and nothing changes too much. In reality, there was other recutting and restructuring of the language that led to the duh coming up. But in comparison, I was like, oh my god, wow, Potawatomi teachers could also start doing that and actively plan to change the language. Hence the title of the paper, Language Pedagogy, or Implications for Language Pedagogy, and my talk having to do, well, there's no gloss, but my talk, the full length is like Implications for Potawatomi Language Planning. That's why this talks about that. So, I remember back to when people said the language is hard, and I thought people get tripped up on verbs. Maybe I could be able to map out verbs for learners so that they can more easily understand them and be able to conjugate on their own easier. And I did something like that. I created verb flowcharts. At the same time, Carla and Kyle, they came back and they kind of just started using def for the present. And amazingly, it's pretty cool. It works pretty well. And they didn't write 25 pages for an academy to read. So who won there? They did. They always win. They're better linguists than I am. This is true. So I'm just going to go over some of the, so this is like some of the charts I drew up for my project last year. This is a transitive animate chart. So when I said it was hierarchical, that means something like there is a hierarchy or an order that the people have to come in. Gin, so the g, it always comes first. You, gin is you. You always come first, regardless if you're the speaker. I'm sorry, you wouldn't be the speaker. That's silly. Regardless if you are the subject or the object. So here you have the g, and you have all of the places in the singular for the singular person object. So a transitive verb is something like see him or her, which is, so if I saw him or her, it would be ngiwapma. So if you fill in the little root, which is wab, you have the n there, and if you follow, it's the 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, fifth row down, the n and the ah. They have the first person subject and third person object. So you have ngiwapma, I saw him or her. But if you have anything that has you involved, ga always comes first. So for a second person object and second person subject and a first person object, you would say something like I will see you is like gwiwalm. So that little O with the cross through it means nothing surfaces, or gwiwalmish. Sorry, you will see me. Apologies, I was confused. And so that's the first one. The second one would be you saw her, gwiwalma. And then first person subject, second person object is like Gigi Wabman, I saw you. And then third person subject, second person object is a little different in the way that it's kind of like backwards, but also it's the same across the language. So you have, so the order of the hierarchy is second person first, then first person, then third person. The second person always comes first. So second person comes before the first person. But first person comes before third person in both. So for the third person subject, first person object, you have ngiwalmuk. And for the second person object, the same thing, it's ggiwalmuk, which is why the EGW is there. Because there are weird sound interactions that surface later. And then for third person, really your only option is like, he saw the other person, which is when the third person comes first, is like ogiwatman. Otherwise, it's already covered in the hierarchy. So if you notice, subject and object aren't exactly fixed. It could be subject verb object, object verb subject, but it always depends on the hierarchy. So from there, I created these little flowcharts, which I have since updated, but this is not updated. So the general idea is you go across the chart, right? And I know it's confusing. It was in my thesis, so of course it was confusing. Linguistics is always confusing. So basically it's like, pick the highest ranked person involved. So you're like, oh, I saw my mom. You would say, oh, first person is higher ranked, so I'll pick n. And then there's no conditional like could, would, should, have, like can. So you're like, oh, I'll pick past tense, right? So you say ngi, and I have the root wam, and then you have this direct action. So So it's first person to third person instead of backwards. Basically, like if you think of subject verb object, that's the direct action. But if it's object verb subject, then it's not direct. So what you have, the third person direct action to the third person. So you pick it, you say, oh, gi, wab, ma. And that's all of that, because I'm not going to go into the plural subjects. Or plural objects, because that's a lot. And this is a broad audience, it's a lot. Maybe if you have questions later, I'll talk about it. So, the usages for this research. I guess it's effective. One time I was sitting with Carl and Kyle and I was going through it and they're like, this is cool. It's a lot. It's cool though. And my proudest moment was like, oh my god, now Carl said, wow, I remember how to say you guys to us, I think, which is in. And she's like, wow, now I remember it. And I was like, I am so proud. I have taught someone something. So the usages of my research are a little more advanced than some classes are at the moment. A lot of the classes now are focusing on, total physical response, which is, you throw a ball and you say it, and you catch a ball and you say what happened. So that was like a recent class a couple weeks ago for Nugget 2, which is It's Difficult, Part 2, which happens on Wednesdays. If you want to come, it's a fun time. So it's like I threw a ball to him, and he poked a wad, and then I caught it. You say that, and then that's the way you learn, so you're really seeing it as you learn. And it gets people speaking. So these charts, again, a little more advanced, or a little farther ahead than where it seems the language program is right now. But at some point, it could be useful. It could be useful in a textbook. You never know. Textbooks are cool. But also, because I am have been so involved in linguistic analysis for a while, I feel like it's important to talk about the interaction between language communities and linguistics. So I'm going to segue away from this large chart. I'm going to go back to the prettier one, that one. I'm going to like it more. So I want to talk about the interaction. So I believe that language communities can benefit from academia. But I also believe that academics have historically benefited more from those language communities. It's not particularly reciprocal, or a few decades ago it was more the tradition where linguists would go in and assume that they knew what was good for the community, and they wouldn't get deeply, deeply embedded in the community and their interactions. They probably wouldn't, go to tribal council meetings and, really just start fights between families. That's what families do, not linguists. Or so you think. Linguists also do that. It's fun. So this means linguists would show up. They would write dictionaries, or they would translate, Bibles. That was more longer ago. What I think is that it's a better idea for linguists to work with people in the community and really get to know them and consistently remember and always try to think, what are the needs of the community so that the language can thrive and people can feel good about it. So in that sense, my work is not intended to validate Potawatomi language or ways of being or culture or traditions in that traditional Western epistemology or in the academy. More so, I want to aim it to my community, so it's for my people. It's not for the consumption of others in the way that a lot of linguists who aren't community members write about languages. Basically, I'm just saying indigenous languages aren't for the consumption of linguists so that they can get tenure, or anthropologists to discover so they can feel nice. And I remember a couple weeks ago, there was an article published by the LSA, which is the Linguistic Society of America, and it said anthropologists discover a previously unknown language in the village in Pacific Ocean area. I can't remember very well, but it was funny because in the article it says these linguists and anthropologists returned to a community they had previously been in before, and they realized that there was another language being spoken that I hadn't noticed. So really, I feel like the title shouldn't be Linguists Discover. It should be some linguists realize there is an entirely different language being spoken in an area that they had previously been to and just overlooked somehow. Right? Like these languages are living through real people. They're changing and they're growing, or they're shrinking and they're being spoken into existence in ways that the Academy hasn't quite seemed to get a grasp on yet. It's harder to explain that way. So these interactions between linguistics and language relation communities are complicated. For the Potawatomi, you know, there are 3 linguists who are Potawatomi who work with the communities. Kind of me, Robert in the back. He's pretty cool. He knows some things, you know. And Lindsey Brand. And so there's 3 linguists in the entire country, 2 of which come from the same band of Potawatomi, and you know there are more than 30,000 Potawatomi in the country. So there are these 3 linguists who know more about the community and know, you know, traditional ways of interacting with people. They have Indian manners, some may say. So there's this difference between working as a linguist in a community and working as a linguist for your community. There are subtle negotiations you have to understand, and there are places you fit, because that's what a community is, right? You live there, you grew up there, you fit in somewhere, and it's easy. So that idea of being a community linguist is an incredible challenge, because you've changed part of your identity to be this academic, but you also stay the same because you want to give back to your community. So it's tough to take an approach to linguistics that isn't actively working as a way of only expanding the linguistic canon. There are many aspects of linguistics that I find myself quarreling with, as I've described as a brief history on linguistics, because I think it's always fun to do. The whole field was built on basically this historical study of Indo-European languages and the Indo-European tradition, and reconstructing Proto-Indo-European, which is a language that was spoken 6,000 years ago, somewhere. Yeah, and it's a large language family, so English, German, you know, they're Indo-European. Also spoken by white people. So much of the field has grown from that, and those languages, their structures, their typologies, syntax, morphology, are what is studied a lot, because that's where it came from. It makes sense, like you grow up from where you come from. So at the same time, there was this history of basically ignoring Native American languages, or just referring to them as one language family, like the big, Pan-Indian dialect, basically, I guess. And it was a process of oversimplifying a very diverse and far-reaching, distinct groups of people and languages. So that was in the early 20th century. At the same time, there was enough research on Indo-European that there were rules and laws that governed centuries-old sound changes in English and Spanish and German or Germanic languages. And basically, they really cared about that, and they didn't care so much about, indigenous languages. That whole movement was eventually followed by linguists realizing that they shouldn't willfully watch the dissolution of their field, because languages were dying due to colonial languages and colonial impositions. Residential boarding schools in North America, in Siberia, and in Australia especially. It's kind of like when that kid said, I don't want to speak Klingon, no one speaks Klingon. People were like, I don't want to speak my native language, it's not good for my job prospects, it's not good for, being safe, it's not good for things. So linguists were like, we can help, I promise. So the field realized they should start to work with languages. And essentially some linguists kind of commodified languages instead. They went into the communities and they worked with them, but some of it was based on they wanted to help languages, but a lot of it was based on they wanted to do research and publish papers. and that got them tenure and research money and notoriety. And at the time, those were languages that people knew very well and spoke fluently and could have analyzed on their own. But instead took the validation of academics to prove that they function in certain ways or were structured in certain ways. Yeah, and that's a trend and a tradition I really focus on a lot, and I want to buck the trend, and I feel like Indigenous linguists can really do that. So yeah, I think that's about it. You know, I love the language. It's fun. The language program for the Peruvian band has done so much, and they're so cool and so smart. Better linguists than I am, and the language kind of feels like home. It's nice. It's up to me.